Hello and welcome to the Voices in Montessori podcast, brought to you by the Green Spring Center for Lifelong Learning. I'm Tamara Sheasley-Ballas, and in today's episode, we're talking about cortical visual impairment and how to support children who are struggling with visual impairments in the Montessori classroom. My guest today is Pamela Shanks. Pam served as the lead guide of an inclusive classroom at Raintree Montessori School and as an administrator at Bowman School. Her work culminated in a deep understanding of Montessori pedagogy and inclusive strategies for children. Pam holds an AMS 3-6 credential and earned a master's degree in special education from the University of Kansas. She currently provides professional development and consulting services for different Montessori schools around the country. Pam's new book, The Montessori Approach to Classroom-Based Interventions, a handbook for educators, administrators, service providers, and families of children whose development is impacted by delay or disability, was just published. Our podcast today is applicable to all educators, not just Montessorians. So if you're an educator in a conventional classroom, there's lots of good meat in here for you as well. Welcome, Pam. We're so excited to have you back with us today.
I'm really excited to be here. I appreciate the invitation. It's a highlight of my day to be able to spend some time with you.
Well, it's definitely a highlight for me as well. I have to tell you, that your work with our staff has really made a tremendous difference in our ability to support children who require accommodations to be successful. And so I'm delighted to be able to bring to our listeners some of your wisdom. You just dropped your book. That's so exciting. And today listeners will be going into one chapter. Pam has 9 different categories in her book, but we're going into one chapter of her book where we talk about cortical visual impairment. And really, this is such a hidden epidemic. So we're gonna go ahead and dig right in.
Great, that sounds good. Let's get started.
So okay, let's talk. What is cortical visual impairment and what impact does it have on our children?
Sure. Cortical visual impairment is the brain's ability to convert images into information that can then be interpreted and acted on. Children do have normal vision, so their vision can be corrected with glasses or contacts. It's not acuity that we're talking about. That visual input then is sent to the brain. It's the brain that struggles to process the information. And the result is an impaired ability to organize or act on that visual information. And I want to pause for just a moment so everyone can consider how this might affect academic skills. The brain is struggling to process visual information. Think about that for a minute. That makes reading, penmanship, composition, mathematics, anything can be impacted. And in fact, research shows that CVI can impact every academic skill and social skills as well. So as an example, a child might see the letters CAT on a page, and they cannot process that image. So the expected action, which of course would be saying cat and blending that to read the word cat, cannot happen. CVI is a visual processing problem. It really doesn't have anything at all to do with cognitive abilities. It has everything to do with locating, focusing, and processing that visual information. Within reading alone, CVI can negatively impact every single word recognition skill, including phonological awareness, decoding, which is reading, encoding, which is spelling, and sight recognition. The effects of CVI range from mild to severe, but its impacts are far-reaching. And it's important to understand, while it's not a well-known disorder, CVI is estimated to impact about 1 in 30 children in developed countries. And I say estimated because less than 20% of children who experience the effects of CVI are ever diagnosed. It is the leading cause of visual impairment in the developed world. CVI is often missed, it's often ignored, it's often misdiagnosed as vision problems, behavior problems, and learning disorders of reading, writing, or math. And this one has been kind of a focus for me. I found a study when writing the book, a 2021 summary study, that confirms what I've believed for a really long time and what honestly I discovered in my own practice with struggling learners in my classroom. And that's that CVI might be the underlying cause for many learning disorders. And that makes disorders like dyslexia, for example, perhaps only a symptom rather than a true diagnosis. But the good news is that adults can help children improve their ability to process visual information. And the chapter that we're talking about, for example, on CVI today, outlines 47 different interventions for learners who struggle with literacy, reading, composition, and mathematical skills. And this kind of variety exists in all the chapters to give adults the ability to be intentional and implement interventions that match the needs they observe.
Mm. Well, and okay, so we're going to talk today about how we accommodate CVI in a Montessori classroom. And I need you to know 1 in 30, I hear that number, but I also want you to know that we found, you presented to my Children's House team, and that we had a couple of learners in every classroom who actually benefited from this significantly, and that really all the children had some experience of being elevated through some of these accommodations. So we'll talk a little bit about that more in a moment. But
Right.
I want you to know that I hear 1 in 30, but I also think that these tools can be so powerful for so many children.
I agree. And part of that is because visual processing is part of the sensory processing system. The youngest learners have the least developed sensory processing system, and that system develops through early elementary. So it's not required that you have a specific disorder for these interventions to work. So that's not surprising to me, and I think that's what's exciting about this chapter specifically. There are really easy Montessori classroom-based interventions to implement.
Great, great. Okay, so let's dig in. Let's talk about how we accommodate CVI in a Montessori classroom. And if you can, it would be great to note levels. So if you're in Children's House, if you're in elementary, are these accommodations for both levels? If you could speak to that as well.
Sure, and most of them will be for any level where you see children struggling with visual memory. So remembering what letter sounds say, remembering numeral names, naming colors, but also struggling with reading, struggling with mathematical equations, struggling with putting a map together. All these require vision. So most of the things I'm going to talk about today can be implemented at any level. And it could be very young children, but it certainly can be older, struggling learners as well. Do you want to talk a little bit about what a Montessori classroom-based intervention is in the beginning to help listeners?
Sure, that would be great. That would be great.
Let's start with that. They're really simple how-to steps that support children who are struggling or experiencing uneven development and developmental differences. They include changes to the environment, the material, the presentation, or maybe the teaching style in order to support children's ability to use materials and learn from their work, just like their peers who are not struggling. The goal is to enhance learning, and they do that by increasing access to content, materials, and the activities of the classroom. And importantly, they make practice with these materials more efficient and more effective. And this is so important because we all know that children who struggle really need more practice than their peers. That's just a reality, a fact of life. So it's really, really important to make any effort that they put into practice as efficient and effective as possible. So to put it simply, Montessori classroom-based interventions support learning. And they do have 6 defining characteristics. And I think when you listen to these, it's easy to assume, or when you read the book, that this was my first step. I defined it, and then I went out and did it, and really it didn't happen that way at all. So this is kind of a definition of my summary, or a summary of my beliefs about classroom-based interventions. Number 1, they're simple. Montessori classroom-based interventions are easy to understand, easy to implement, I wanted the book to be practical, pragmatic, and easy to use. The second one is that they're flexible. They are easily adjusted or removed based on the child's response to the intervention. And that's really important to observe the response once the intervention is in place to help you understand how long to keep that intervention in place and whether or not it's working. They need to be intentional. Montessori classroom-based interventions are selected carefully based on an understanding of the entire child, the whole child, including background information and observations. You're going to use this information about the whole child to intentionally select interventions to address observed or identified needs. They're also focused. Montessori classroom-based interventions are focused on enhancing children's ability to use materials, participate in activities, and then after that demonstrate their learning and development. The fifth one is that they're research informed. Montessori classroom-based interventions are supported by research and by best practice techniques. And then finally, of course, they maintain fidelity to the Montessori method. They make the experience authentic, a Montessori experience. Because I believe as Montessorians, everything we do to help children who are struggling or presenting observable developmental differences needs to be grounded by and aligned with the Montessori methodology. My definition, I think, makes that really clear, that belief of mine. But that said, while the interventions in the book are aligned with Montessori practice and methodology, most of them can be used in traditional classrooms and by families also looking for answers and support strategies.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so can you talk about specifically CVI in the Montessori classroom?
Yeah, we can talk about that a little bit. I think one of the interventions that is so exciting to implement. I think you mentioned that you had learners who benefited after I presented. Can you name the one thing? Wasn't it the black mat that we talked
The
about?
black mat. The
Yeah.
black mat. Who knew? All
Yeah.
of our rugs in the classroom, of course, have been white. And then we also have some that have the light blue stripes. I think
Yes.
Montessori Services sold those for a long time. They're great for the movable alphabet.
Yes.
And then the tables are wood and
Yes.
shiny, right?
Yes.
Beautiful wood tables.
Yes.
And the black mat made all the difference.
Yeah, well, let's talk about why that works. And before I hit interventions, I do want to say anytime you're worried about children's learning, you want to make sure they've had a recent vision or hearing screening, well, vision and hearing, because these two important information gathering systems are, of course, critical to learning. So, as part of understanding the whole child and being intentional in selecting interventions, we need to know those systems are intact. The interventions that are included in the CVI chapter focus on three things. We're going to help children develop their ability to locate, attend to, and process visual images. And the use of a black mat under children's work, such as sandpaper letters, numerals, a book, the stamp game, the flat bead frame, anything, resolves what is called visual complexity. Visual complexity makes locating, attending to, and processing an image much harder for children who are struggling. Visual complexity can be created in many ways. One way is when an image is viewed against a complex background. That might be the busy background of a classroom. So if I hold up a sandpaper letter for children to identify rather than keeping it grounded on a table or on a mat, you're creating a really busy background by holding it up. A visually busy surface, like a plaid table, or as you mentioned, the wood grain of a table, can create a visually complex background. And then visual complexity can also be created when a surface bounces light back at the eye, and that creates glare. So when you think about the beautiful tables in our Montessori classrooms, they often have that high gloss finish, and that can bounce light back at the eye and create glare. And if you think about headlights when you're driving at night, there's a certain point when an oncoming car's headlights are so strong, the glare is so bright that you shift your vision away. It makes it hard to look at the road and see what you need to see. And that's what happens for children, except that feeling that they need to shift their vision and not look comes sooner, and it's much, much stronger. That's part of CVI. So I think in order to understand this, we need to talk a little bit too about The difference between the colors black and white, because I'm advocating black mats. And so why is black important? And that's because visible light is made up of all the colors, right? So think of the rainbow that you see when light passes through a prism. That breaks light into the colors. But black absorbs all the colors, the visible light spectrum. White and light colors, on the other hand, reflect all the colors of the visible light spectrum. So when black absorbs it, that black mat underneath children's work means that light is being absorbed rather than being bounced back at the eye and creating glare. And this makes looking easier for children struggling with visual memory skills like letter or numeral identification or reading. And that's why the black mat helps. And honestly, I think this was your staff's experience as well. It's why results often can be immediately observed.
We certainly had that experience. We had a little guy that one of our guides had been working with for, probably a year and a half, 2 years, and gave so many lessons to, and he was really struggling and he was really trying. He so wanted it. And so right after your workshop, she went out and got a black mat and she put it underneath, and she said it was like magic. Like all of a sudden he could hold this information because it wasn't a cognitive issue. He really was experiencing where she said that she thought the light was bouncing off the table and he just couldn't see it. And so she put the letters on the black mat, and all of a sudden this child had the capacity in a way that he just didn't have before. It was remarkable.
It is. I had the experience of doing the same thing for a little one who was struggling, but visual or locating and attending especially to sandpaper letters was really hard. And so if you think of an R, not a cursive R, but a print or a Danielian R with that little rainbow at the top, the little curve at the top, and that's what I always call it. If we're going to go down and up and over for a rainbow for children who are struggling with tracing, I add a few auditory cues occasionally. And when I put that letter R on the map for the first time, she went, "Oh, I can see the rainbow." And I just thought that was so telling. It was like before that had not been apparent to her.
She couldn't see it.
Yeah.
Wow. That was a big one. What else? What else can guides do in the classroom?
Sure. Another characteristic demonstrated by children with CVI, and there's about CVI has many characteristics that are common to children, but there are 4 that I really honed in on in my own practice as I began thinking about CVI and children who were struggling. And one of those 4 is a strong color preference. Color can act like a visual anchor and enhance the ability to locate, focus on, and process visual images. Red is one color often preferred by children who experience severe CVI especially. And if you think about it, this makes sense because it's the very first color that infants can see. And so to illustrate how red can support learning, I want to tell you the stories of a couple of children that I had the honor of working with. One was a little boy who was typically developing toddler when suddenly he began having grand mal seizures, really strong, intense, long-lasting seizures. And despite his parents and his medical team's best effort, by the time he was a preschool, it was clear that every option they tried wasn't working. And the next one was agreeing to a hemispherectomy. So that was surgery that disconnected or removed the diseased half of his brain. And as you can imagine, after surgery, he'd lost a lot of skills, some forever. Academic skills had to be relearned. A lot of language skills had to be relearned. And before surgery, he was typically developing. He could name all his colors, no problem at all. After surgery, interestingly enough, he could name red, which I thought was so interesting, and he could name yellow. But he struggled to learn anymore. And about this time, I learned about CVI going to a conference, and his OT was there too. And we both independently came to the conclusion that this little boy demonstrated visual characteristics that matched CVI. So the poor presenter, at the break, we went up and, started talking to her instead of letting her go to the restroom or rest or whatever. And she said, treat him as if he has CVI, which we did. So the next time I saw him at school, I went back and I took him to a quiet room by himself, turned off every light except a little light to focus on the work itself, laid out a black mat, got the second box of color tablets, and started laying only one tablet on the rug at a time and then taking it away, because too much work in a space can also create visual complexity. So I laid out red. What does that say? And he named red. I laid out yellow, took it away. He named yellow. I laid out the rest of the colors one by one. He called green, yellow, and green, and he also named purple, which is made of red. Again, I thought it was really interesting. But at that moment when I got done, I sat there and suddenly I was just devastated, because I realized that it wasn't just the surgery that was preventing him from learning and demonstrating what he knew. It was me. I hadn't provided him with the right visual conditions to learn and grow and develop. But at the same time, I was joyous and hopeful. It was the weirdest combination of feelings, because suddenly I knew what I could do. And so from that point on, we worked as if he had CVI. And he had a little peer who, by the time the summer before her kindergarten year, she could only name 2 numerals. And I was working with her with the sandpaper numerals consistently every day, doing everything I could, playing games, all those things. And one day I realized she was taking a lot of visual breaks, which again is another characteristic of children with CVI. They'll look away up at a corner of the room or look at a blank wall and just stare for a long time. And it suddenly dawned on me. I thought, wow, that's odd that she's taking so many visual breaks. I wonder what would happen if I treated her as if she had CVI. So we moved to a quiet corner of the classroom, laid out a black mat, dimmed the lights over there, made sure I was away from any smells or sounds, going on in the classroom. And she named a numeral she'd never named before. And so from that point on, anybody who struggled with learning any visual thing, colors, letters, numeral names, any of those things, I treated as if they had CVI. And we still did use the sandpaper letters. Oh, the other thing I didn't say about that was I brought over, instead of using the sandpaper letters, I brought over the wooden numeral cards that people often use with the red and blue rods, little wooden cards with red numerals printed on them. And I used those instead of the sandpaper letters. And so from that point on, we used the sandpaper letters only to help with penmanship. But the red numeral cards were what I used for her 3-period lesson and for any practice with visual memory, because they were a part of what enhanced her ability to learn numeral names. And so, again, from that point on, I treated any child who was struggling with any visual memory task as if they had CVI. And the reason that red was important was because it drew children's visual attention. And so it was a classroom-based intervention that, in combination with that black rug, really helped support learning. And that my book highlights other ways that you can use red to enhance practice and learning.
Okay, so a couple questions in there. So you said a black rug. You also, I know, our group, I think they got black placemats.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah, I think black placemats work really well. That's what I used in my own classroom. Now, black like silicon mats or black desk mats that you might use as a desk protector. I've seen people use those and they work very well. You want to think about the reflective surface. So trying to get a dull or a matte finish is important. But yeah, I do think there are so many more options now than when I was starting, 20 years ago, trying to find black mats to use to work with in the classroom.
And then so for red letters, because the sandpaper, the numerals are easier because you do have that set from the red and blue rods, the number rods. But what about, do you use the movable alphabet? How do you make the sandpaper letter? How do you make letters?
Right. I get your question. I do think most of these children who are struggling, the sensitive period for sandpaper letters ends around age 4. So if you're not doing sandpaper letters early, you're missing the sensitive period. So by the time they're 4.5, sandpaper letters are not thrilling anymore. They don't want to trace them. It's just, they're past that. And if they're struggling with movable alphabets, when you think of a floor alphabet, which is where you should start with large letters, that's important for little people. But when you start with those large letters, it is so tough to keep a movable alphabet straight and neat. Drove me crazy as a type A person. I wanted my, letters to be stacked on top of each other so it looked like an A or it looked like an R and not, hard to identify because the letters were moving around in the box. So I do think there's a lot of visual complexity with movable alphabets, not just because they are full of 26 letters, but also because they're hard to keep straight and orderly and looking like letters. And so when these children had difficulty, and if the floor alphabet was challenging for them to use, one of the things I advocate is that you move to a table alphabet. And I loved table alphabets that were little plastic cards, and on one side is the lowercase letter. When you flip it over, the uppercase is on the other side. And those often come in colors, and that way you can get red. So I kept an alphabet in my classroom that had red consonants and blue vowels, and an alphabet that had blue consonants and red vowels. So if I wanted to emphasize a specific vowel that was hard for children to memorize, maybe U, for example, not used as often, can be a tricky one. So if we're doing a little bit of dictation or whatever, you could use the alphabet that had red vowels, and then that red U in cup and mug and tub all would be there being highlighted because they're red and they stand out.
A quick promotion for Allison's Montessori, who has a movable alphabet box that's configured to hold the letters in place. So children who can struggle with visual acuity, that the letters are all lined up, and they don't always have to be cleaning up the movable alphabet box because the letter holders are carved out just for each letter perfectly. So see our show notes for that link, and it'll take you right to that product. And can you share why you liked having the capital letter on the other side?
Just because it was really easy then to transition to sentences. I taught cursive, and we had cursive sandpaper letters. And that's another intervention I think is important. Cursive has a whole lot of advantages that you can read about in my book as well. And so having those cursive letter capitals on the back was really nice for emphasizing, as they began to create sentences, a name or a proper noun, or the beginning of a sentence begins with a capital, so we need to flip this over and use that side, and then putting a period at the end. Those alphabets often come with punctuation as well. So it's a really easy way to transition to sentences and begin giving those introductory lessons in capitalization and punctuation.
Great. Perfect. Anything else we need to be thinking about within that framework of red, really using red when we can for children? We have the black mat. I know you have 47 interventions. What other ones can you give us today?
Yeah, I think when you think about red, often parts of cards, the parts of the roots or whatever, especially in elementary classrooms, are often red. Montessori used red a lot, and there's a quote in my book that gave me chills when I read it. So I'll leave that there as kind of a teaser for the listeners. But Montessori understood the power of red. And so it makes me wonder if that's why red appears so often in sensorial and in math and in language as part of materials. So I do think she would approve of the use of red as well. And then in terms of other really simple, this is a simple one for listeners to use in their classroom. Another classroom-based intervention is to change how you show pictures when you're reading to children. And this could be especially for toddlers because, as I said, their sensory systems are underdeveloped. And so, and they should be, that's normal for their age. So you're helping them develop their sensory system. But it could also be if you're reading to elementary students and you're showing pictures and you have a struggling learner in your group, how you show pictures may make a difference for older students as well. So teachers, I think, often read and then they show the book by holding up that book and slowly moving it across the group from left to right or right to left so that everyone has a chance to see the picture. But when you do that, you're requiring children to do two things. You're requiring them to locate and focus on what they want to look at as it moves across the thing. So they have to track with their eyes as well. So instead, what you want to do is read the book, turn it around, hold it up, let those children look on that side of the group. And while you're doing that, you want to watch their visual attention, watch their eyes. Their eyes are going to shift away when they're done looking. And that tells you that then you can move it to the center, let that group of children see it, and again, watch for their visual attention, and then move the book to the last side so that you've shown the book until you've shown the book to the entire group.
And just real quick, those of you who are on the podcast and not watching this, she's holding it still, right?
Yes.
So she's holding the book for one section of the class up still after she's read and not moving it. So not asking them to track while they're trying to hone in on the picture.
Right. So you're making it easier for children to locate, attend to, and process that visual information, because when the book is moving, they do have to visually track the moving pictures and process them all at the same time. And if you think about it, especially for primary teachers, this is going to land. You're not isolating difficulty. You're asking the brain to do two things at the same time, and that's always going to be harder. And like I said, this is really critical for young children like toddlers. If you begin watching for visual attention as a cue to begin reading again, you're going to understand all of a sudden how long it takes toddlers to process things and especially look at new things. And it's going to slow you down. And you're going to begin moving at the children's pace when you show pictures rather than requiring the children to follow your pace.
I love that. It's almost like you're saying follow the child, Pam.
Yes, I might be saying that quite a bit. And in CVI especially, that's a really critical thing to do, is to follow the child, because using their vision is really, really hard. It's tiring. It's exhausting. It is challenging for them. You're asking them to do the hardest thing that they have to do all day. And so they're going to wear out and they're going to fatigue. So making it easier, enhancing that ability to see and following their cue is really important.
That's a great tip. And would you say that slowing down in general is one of the tools, one of the accommodations that folks can make for CVI?
Yeah, I would say that. And honestly, slowing down in general for any child who's struggling, I think is important, especially if you suspect it to be a sensory processing problem. So vision is a sense. This is a sensory processing problem when you think about it. And the first several chapters of the book do cover specific sensory processing issues. When you move quickly or when sensation is flooding the brain, it's harder for the brain to process that information. And when you speak slowly, when you slow down, when you use a bit quieter voice, that tells the brain to calm down. But if you're speaking quickly and you're moving through and you're reading and you're doing things quickly, it tells the brain to hurry up and it tells the child to hurry up, and then they can't keep up with you, and that becomes frustrating and it's harder. So yes, slowing down often is something that helps children, and especially giving them time to respond. And again, this is easy to see in a toddler, easy to see in a child with visual processing problems. If you ask them to name something and you wait, a toddler might take a long time. It might be 8 or 10 seconds, which is a long time, an uncomfortably long time to wait. Same thing for a child with visual processing problems. You want to make sure they're giving them enough time. So I always advocate using children's vision, often when children don't know the answer or when they are struggling, they'll quickly glance at you. And I always say use that vision shift as a cue to help, or a cue to ask the question again or move on or whatever is appropriate in that situation. But watch how they use their vision, when they use their vision, because it's going to tell you a lot about what they understand, when they're having trouble, and when they want help.
That's so helpful. Thank you. I mean, I have to tell you, when I was in a children's house classroom, I had to work so hard every day before I'd go in and to teach. I would really have to find my grounding and do a meditative practice so that I would slow down and quiet my voice and quiet my energy. I don't you know, I had to meet them. Instead of asking them to meet me.
Yeah, I agree. My head of school was fond of saying that I was a completely different person when I walked into my classroom. And it just is important to be the calmest person you can be for those little tiny people who are still struggling to process information, and their systems are working to integrate each moment of every single day. So yes, I do think slowing your voice down, slowing the pace of what you do down. We all know that as primary teachers, especially in toddlers as well. When you present, you slow the pace down of your movements so children can follow them. You just want to take that piece of information that you already know and apply it to struggling learners and apply it to the classroom in general.
Mm-hmm. Love that. Okay, so what else? What else can we be thinking about?
Sure. I think there are another really simple intervention for children who are struggling with visual memory is to pair some sort of writing or sound or work with or numeral naming. You always want to pair some sort of writing with it. These children, again, are long past their sensitive period for sandpaper letters and numerals, and they still need that repetition to learn them. They still need some practice. And pairing writing or composition with sound or numeral naming whenever possible is a very important intervention. Dr. Montessori was so right about everything, but especially this when she said intelligence can develop to a certain point without the help of the hand. But if it develops with the hand, then the level it reaches is higher. So you want to make sure that as soon as children can record any information at all, that there's some sort of recording in some format to enhance learning, whether that's with a movable alphabet, with chalk, or with pencils, to enhance practice. So one little boy I had whose family had a history of learning differences, so lots of dyslexia among siblings and parents in this little boy's family. Was struggling with learning letter sounds. It wasn't a surprise to his family or to me. And so I was treating him as if he had CVI. And he wouldn't use the movable alphabet. And letters were hard. He played every single sound game with me, every I Spy game ever created in my classroom he joined. But yet at the age of 4.5, he could not break down a simple word into its sounds. And so we began doing the table movable alphabet with a window, which is an intervention that's a little challenging to explain. So I'll leave maybe that one to the book unless we have a lot of time to go into it. But he was really motivated because he loved drawing. So what we did was I helped him sound out a word. In the beginning, we did just letters, but as he began to be able to connect those letters in cursive, we did words, simple words, and then harder words. And then I would help him sound it out with the window so that he could use the movable alphabet. The letters would be laid on the table and he could copy them. Copying letters and handwriting was easy for him because I treated handwriting as a separate sequence from reading and letter recognition. So just because he couldn't say D reliably every time I showed him that sandpaper letter, I didn't not move him on with handwriting because he could form a D better than I could in cursive. His handwriting was beautiful. So once we got that word on the table using the movable alphabet, he could copy the letter. He could make it fit on the lines. His handwriting, like I said, was beautiful. And then he could draw a picture of a dog or whatever. And that ability to provide the intervention at the beginning and walk away left him, I think, with an I did it feeling. Even though I had to help him with the initial part, by the time he was done with that, he did it. And every time he wrote D when we were working on letters, or every time he wrote dog when we were working on sounds, he's still looking at those letters and connecting it to what he knew about that activity and the sounds that he was learning. And so I do think it's really important. It was beneficial to him. It took me maybe 10 minutes to sit down with him to do it, or 8, depending on what we were sounding out. And eventually he got to the point where he didn't need help using the movable alphabet, or he got to the point where he said, do you think I can try this without the movable alphabet? Sure, let's try it. And so by the time he left for kindergarten, he was composing sentences on his own. He still needed a little help holding on to the words that he wanted to write. He'd get so involved in sounding something out, he'd forget what the sentence was that he was started with, or he might have needed a little help remembering a few simple sounds. But he would ask, is that, especially those alternate spellings, do I use I to say I in ride? Is that an I? He would say, yes. The sound or the letter that we sound out as I becomes an I. That's the one you want to write in that silent E word. And so occasionally he would need that kind of help. But he went from, not being able to sound anything out to writing sentences before he left for kindergarten. And so I do think that is an important piece. And I do think writing is what helped him solidify that information.
Mm-hmm. A different way into the brain.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And it just is, it's activating different sides of the brain. To your point, it's activating different parts of the brain. And that's one thing that CVI and reading have in common. There is no reading area in the brain. Reading requires many different areas to be integrated and work together in order for reading to occur. And the same thing for CVI. It requires integration of many skills of the sensory system and the sensory processing system in order for it to occur as well. So those things do share that in common.
Beautiful, beautiful. Well, we have a little bit more time. So if you wanted to try to talk about the window, then we could wrap up for today.
Okay, we'll do the best we can, and readers can refer to the book if they're interested.
Right. That's right.
Okay, so another simple intervention, like I said, this little boy was using a movable alphabet, but again, it's even a table alphabet with the little cards like I like can be very overwhelming with all those letters. And so I transitioned him to that movable alphabet, but we used a window to highlight the letter he was looking for. And that's because using a window so that you're highlighting only 3 letters of that movable alphabet, it highlights the difference between second period knowledge and third period knowledge, which I think especially for elementary teachers who are using this is important to understand. It's an example of Montessori's brilliance as an educator. Children can select letters from a movable alphabet long before they can say each letter's sound. And that's why writing with a movable alphabet comes before reading in Montessori. Children don't have to be at that third period level and be able to say each letter's sound to use a movable alphabet. They just have to be at that second stage, the second period, and be able to select a letter from an array of letters. So selecting letters from a movable alphabet only requires second period knowledge. But those movable alphabets, as I've mentioned, are visually complex. And so what I did was to create a window. I got a piece of black felt, or you can use other fabric, and I cut it the size of the box. And then in the center, I measured the size that the window would need to be to frame 3 letters. And I cut that, generally in the center of the piece of fabric. It doesn't have to be exact. And so I cut a hole the size of 3 letters. So only 3 letters appeared. So suddenly this movable alphabet that shows you every letter in the alphabet and some punctuation is only 3 letters. And as a child builds words, for those difficult sounds to find, you want to frame 3 letters. So now the child, again, is no longer looking at one among many. They're looking at one among 3. And that reduces visual complexity. And so the one thing you want to remember is when you're framing letters, if you're framing the letter M, for example, you don't always want M to be in the first position. M should sometimes be in the middle. M should be sometimes the 3rd letter in that frame of an opening. So you want to mix it up to make sure that children aren't just always choosing that first position, the letter in the first position. They're really looking and showing that. And so that's what I did. And I have videos of him that I showed your staff that are so fun to watch. He wants to sound like dinosaur. He has a hard time figuring out the first sound, if I'm remembering right. I give him that D for dinosaur, and he looks at the alphabet on the table, And then he looks at me and I say, "Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to put out the window. Would you like me to do that?" And he said, "Yes." And I laid it down. And almost before I could get the window down, framing 3 letters, he picks up that D. It's incredibly impressive. And even for me at that time, when I started using a window with him, I sat there thinking, he knows more than I thought he did. Because once things were limited and the visual complexity was gone, he could choose letters, almost every letter he needed, really quickly. So his second period knowledge was much better than I had envisioned it being. He couldn't demonstrate that without the window because of the complexity that a movable alphabet presents.
Wow. It shows how much we have to be observing and really deeply in tune with our students to understand them and to understand their needs. So when you've put these protocols and these accommodations into place for a child,
Right.
once they have built the skills, do you wean them off of them? How does that look?
That's a really, really good question, because that's a traditional special education approach, is that you want to wean them off of those skills. You wean them off of their accommodations. And with any sensory system that is still integrating, you don't want to do that. You leave those accommodations in place until the child no longer needs them. And you can do a little test every once in a while. So if I'm trying to teach numerals and they seem to be going really well, I say, well, let's use the sandpaper numerals today and see which you like better, the red numerals or the sandpaper numerals. And let's see which ones work better for you. Oh, okay. You like these better? Great. That's easier for you, no problem. So it's you don't want to test in a way that tells the child you're testing, but every once in a while you can use other things to check. But often I would just wait for the transition to occur naturally, for children to look at me and say, I don't think I need this anymore. Can we try it without? Or I don't want to use a red pencil, for example. Recording with a red pencil is a nice intervention as well. I want to write with a regular pencil. Is that okay? Sure. Let's try it and see how it works. Once children are beginning to be able to see and locate and process information better, it's there. The visual system, that means the system is developing. And that's a well-known, understood part of CVI, is that those symptoms or characteristics are going to resolve as the brain's ability to process visual information improves. And so the originator of this original research called it the characteristics resolving. And so that's something that's been seen forever and a long time.
That's so interesting. Now, you talked a little bit about research, but is there anything else you'd like to add about the research on CVI?
Well, I think it's ongoing. It's becoming more and more important, and a really, really, really great place to go for more information about CVI is the Perkins Institute website. They have a CVI section, a whole new one that was developed recently. I want to say maybe 4 to 5 years ago, called, I believe, CVI Now. But if you do a Google search for Perkins Institute and CVI, I think it'll come up. But I do believe it's CVI Now. And they have great information, great resources, great, easy to understand and very usable information. And so I think if you want to learn more, that's one really good place on the web that you can go to learn more about CVI. I will say that using it in regular education settings, I believe, needs to happen more often, whether children have a diagnosis or not. And again, for CVI, just by interventions, you can help improve their visual processing. And so by implementing interventions really early when a teacher first suspects trouble, you might prevent that diagnosis. You might help a children's system integrate enough and work better enough that you prevent this massive problem that could happen later on without these interventions. So I think that's an important thing to understand, is that symptoms can resolve, the visual processing system can work much better, children can learn to read without accommodations, although they might need them in the beginning, or interventions that they might need in the beginning. And so I do think it's important to understand the importance of early use of these interventions. And like I said, CVI Now is a great resource.
Yeah, there's so much. Okay, so we're going to wrap up here, but is there anything else you want us to know before we close? Because you've given us so much important information today. And candidly, information that I think a lot of folks in Montessori, this is new information for. And we're so grateful. Is there anything else that you want to say or should be thinking about?
You know, I think using interventions, I think everybody needs to know about them. I certainly know that every classroom in America, every Montessori classroom or classroom in America have children who are struggling. And this book is really for the people who want to do the best they can. And once you use an intervention and you see it work, it's almost addictive as an adult, I have to say, because you understand, like I did with that little boy, it's not that he can't learn, he can. And all I have to do are these simple little things to make it easier for him. Now, not every struggle is going to be that easy to resolve. And it's going to take work. It's still going to take practice. It's still going to take time, all those things. But once you experience the joy that comes with a child who is suddenly, they're suddenly making progress. Once you experience that joy, it's a profound feeling. And I just wish that for everybody. And that's a big goal of this book, is to give guides the ability and adults the ability to use these interventions and see these things happen for the children that they love and value and respect in their lives.
Mm, bravo.
Thank
I just
you.
want to say thank you for writing this book and for I mean, you've done decades of research and your own work in the classroom. And thank you for doing everything it takes to put it down, pen to paper, and helping share it with the Montessori world. And candidly, so much of what you shared today would be appropriate for any educator. This is not just for Montessorians. This is for any educator who's working with children and seeing a need. All of this can be modified for a more conventional classroom. I just want to say thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been heartwarming to see the response to the book. I think I've got a lot of feedback that says that it's practical, that it's easy to use, that it's organized. It makes my heart sing to hear those things, because that certainly was a goal. So I appreciate the opportunity to talk about it today, and an opportunity to talk about my passion, helping children who are struggling.
I agree. I was lucky enough to get an early copy, and it is so practical. It gives you an how to, and that is what we're all about, is how do we make this easy for folks? We have people out there who are doing the most important work in the world of working with children, and how do we support them in meeting the needs of every child? So thank you so much, Pam, and thank you for your book. And we will link to the book in the show notes, folks, so that you can, it's called The Montessori Approach to Classroom-Based Interventions, a handbook for educators, administrators, service providers, and families with children whose development is impacted by delay or disability. And we really appreciate you, Pam. We also, listeners, appreciate you all. You're doing the most important work in the world. We're very grateful that you spent your time with us today, and that we can support your practice and support the little people that you serve. Please take a look at our website at greenspringcenter.org to view the show notes from today's episode. And we invite you to subscribe to our podcast and hear the latest episodes, and join in the conversation on Facebook and Instagram. As Dr. Montessori said, an education capable of saving humanity is no small undertaking. We agree. The work you all do is the most important, and we're here to help. We'll see you next time.